are Unitarian Universalists. When we lift up our 7 principles, some of us think of them as a form of theology, but they are more important to our collective than that. They do not tell us what we should believe. They tell us how we should be. They tell us how we should act in the larger world and with each other. So open your hearts, seek new ways of understanding, and come, let us worship together. We light our flaming chalice as a beloved people, united in love, and thirsting for restorative justice. Today's reading is a story from Reverend Scott Alexander about one of our own Universalist ancestors. The Universalist preacher Hosea Bayou was preaching in Boston when a rock sailed through the window and landed near him. Now, even way back then, there was a real battle going on for the soul of America. And without missing a beat, this Unitarian Universalist, or this Universalist evangelist, picked up the large stone and said, "This argument is solid and weighty, but it is neither reasonable nor convincing." Put the rock aside, and he added, "Not all the stones in Boston, except they stop my breath, shall shut my mouth." Bayou and the other early American Universalists bravely preached a gospel of inclusion, reconciliation, and hope, right in the face of Calvinistic negativity. A gospel that unashamedly affirmed the oneness and worth of all persons. So today we have Dr. Karen Wills. She is the Executive Director of Moose Jaw, the Minnesota UU Social Justice Alliance, the network of 31 UU congregations across Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Moose Jaw supports congregational UU human rights, social action, and climate justice leaders in their partnerships with Black and Indigenous leaders, people of color, and others from the frontline communities that are most harmed by the injustices and oppressions.
In one of the Curiosity Guild gatherings, when we were talking about the reading about the enormous change that had happened with a congregation in, I think, Tulsa, when they had essentially merged with a local Black congregation when that congregation had lost its building. And as a result of sort of being in that space with some of you, it got me thinking about bridges and connections and how we form them and how they evolve. Shortly after that, part of my work with Moose Jaw was to bring a carton full of several thousand postcards, which were sort of too expensive on our small budget to ship, up to several locations in North Dakota and northern Minnesota. So I drove from my home in Bloomington, which is just south of the Twin Cities, up to St. Cloud and Buffalo, and then up to Brainerd and Bemidji, and over to Fargo, and then back over to Fergus Falls, and made this little journey. And in the course of that journey, to deliver those postcards to folks who were writing them to underrepresented voters last year, between Moorhead, Minnesota, and Fargo, North Dakota. And it was a tiny little bridge, barely wide enough for 2 cars to cross simultaneously. And in fact, I waited for the oncoming car to get past before I scooched my little Prius across there. And as I crossed the bridge over this little tiny creek, there was a sign that said, "Welcome to North Dakota." And I'm like, this is so weird. I'm on a back street in a small town, and I've just crossed a border. And what does that mean? And how would you ever know if it wasn't for that little tiny sign? And it got me thinking about how we build bridges, how we cross bridges, and how we use them and what they are for. So I started to do what you people do, which is to research a little bit about, kind of what is it about that? And I'm going to ask any of you who are listening, who are actually real structural or mechanical engineers, to give me a little grace here, and room for poetic license, because I'm using this notion of bridges very metaphorically, and I will probably say something that is, mechanically and engineering wise, a bit of a stretch, but bear with me if you will. I went online and I found this really marvelous website by a British science writer called Chris Woodford, called explainthatstuff.com, right? And I thought any church that has a gathering called Curiosity Guild would probably appreciate Explain That Stuff. And Chris Woodford says this about bridges: buffeted by winds from above, scoured by rivers from below, pounded by traffic all day long, it's a miracle, mind you, that bridges stay upright as long as they do. Forces make things move, but they also hold them still. It's far from obvious, but when something like a skyscraper looms high above us or a bridge stretches out beneath our feet, hidden forces are hard at work. A bridge goes nowhere because all the forces acting on it are perfectly in balance. Bridge designers, in short, are force balancers. So I started thinking about that in relation to what y'all are doing, which is discerning and working towards the process of calling a settled minister. And I've been in churches, I've been in a lot of churches, as you heard, and in some of them, I've been in churches during that span of time when there is that holy tension between holding still and moving forward, and between reflecting on the past, thinking about what's going on in the present, and thinking about what you want the future to be. And so at this time when I'm in a new job and I'm doing the same thing, thinking about the past of Moose Jaw, the present, and what I want our future to be, together with my board and, hundreds, the 1,000 or so people who are active supporters of this organization, and the 6,000 Unitarian Universalists who are part of our world as UUs in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota. And I don't know what the numbers are, but you saw in that video song many, many hundreds and thousands of people across this country, across America and Canada, who are part of the Unitarian Universalist Association. So when we think about bridges and how we build them and what they're for, from the past to the future, from Minnesota to North Dakota, from North Dakota to this world of UUs, and from a small majority white town and a small majority white denomination of Unitarian Universalists to a larger world that is increasingly and moving towards predominantly multiracial, multicultural, and multi-generational. Oof, you know, how do we bridge that? How are we going to bridge that? And why are we trying? And what are those bridges for? So I've been doing a lot of thought about those connections. When I come back to that metaphor, another thing I learned from Chris Woodford is that these forces that bridge builders think about balancing involve creating the abutments, the strong pillars that kind of hold that bridge in place, and the piers that hold the middle. And they talk about the balance between two forces. One is the force of compression, pushing together, and the other is the force of tension, which is the pulling apart force. We talk a lot in UU spaces about the tensions, that tensile strength that can pull us apart from one another when we have political or racial or generational or gender related or other kinds of differences, or religious differences for that matter. And I've been hearing about that and thinking about it all my life, but it's very interesting, I think, to put that into the context of bridge building, with there also being this balance between those tensile forces and the forces of compression. Because we also talk in UU spaces a lot about oppression, suppression, the idea that there are forces in society that are trying to sort of squish our souls and our voices and our spirits and prevent us from being able to move forward, to be able to get from where we are now to where we want to be. And yet some of those forces of compression also are what hold us together. The kind of love that's holding people together in families across a political divide that is explosive, the kind of trust that holds people together in communities across religious divides. So that balance of forces between what is holding us together and what's pulling us apart is a continual holy tension that we're in conversation around within UU congregations, as well as between UUs and people in interfaith spaces and people in larger community spaces. I'm thinking about those balances. And I think it was really useful to read and start thinking about bridge building in the sense that bridge builders are force balancers. I was in a meeting recently where there was some concern about the idea that we wanted in our state action networks to be able to balance our efforts towards holding our people together and moving our people, our UU people, into closer relationship and more effective followership with more communities of color and frontline people who are facing oppressions. And how do we balance that? And what came out of that conversation is that it is really important, I think, for us as Unitarian Universalists to begin to think about balance in the way that bridge builders do, as a multifactorial function of dynamic adjustments, of continually flexibly changing tensions among pressure, pulling together, and pulling apart, compressive forces and tensile forces. To think about balance, maybe in the sense that Alexander Calder used to balance his mobiles or stabiles, where there were a bunch of different chunks of stuff that needed to be able to move continually and flexibly without crashing down or smashing into one another. And the balance isn't like those junior high, two-part, two-tray balance scales where you have two things and both sides are equal. And there are nice people on both sides, as a former president said. That isn't what we're talking about in terms of balancing all of the forces that we need to contain. What we think of in terms of balancing is keeping that bridge stable, keeping it from falling down, keeping that mobile moving without crashing down. My bridge guy from Britain says that there are two things that cause bridges to collapse. One is when a sudden stress or pressure comes along that causes the bridge to become overloaded, to lose the balance, so that there is either a huge hurricane that's shaking it so badly that it cannot stand, or a sudden unexpected weight, a huge amount of traffic that doesn't allow it to continue. And we've seen that happen sometimes with organizations and congregations where we just weren't prepared for what was going to come along, and it can shake us. And then we really have rebuilding to do. And the other thing that causes the bridges to fall down is just called fatigue. Anybody who's just made it through 2020 knows all about fatigue. The fatigue that can cause our bridges to one another and to our communities to collapse largely happens as a result of lack of maintenance. Sometimes it happens simply because of age, but generally there are bridges that have lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's because someone has kept an eye on it, someone has maintained it. And so this idea that the bridges that we build as well require continual monitoring and continual maintenance and cannot be taken for granted is also a part of that metaphor. I'm thinking about all of these ways that bridges are constructed and how they function and how they work, and how complex and flexible and yet stable they need to be. I'm in the process of unpacking that, and I think that there's a lot in that metaphor that comes back into our organizations and our congregations. Holding those different kinds of force in balance with one another, flexibly and stably, really is the work that we're doing. The second piece of this, though, is what the bridges are for. Why do they exist at all? What do we need them for, and what are we using them for? And as someone who has grown up as a Unitarian Universalist, for whom my congregation as a little girl was sending members to Selma, sending people to ride with the Freedom buses, sending people up to Haight-Ashbury during the Summer of Love. I was born in 1956. I was 12 in 1968. And when I was at that age, just entering into the autonomy and responsibility and passion for fairness that teenagers have. The heroes of my world, Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Malcolm X, were being murdered. That was a backdrop to my moving into my teenage years. And the adults in my congregation were weeping and marching. And my dad, who was a closeted gay man at the time, had not yet come out until Harvey Milk started marching in 1980. My dad was just beginning to explore his identity. My mom was doing fundraisers in California for the Freedom Marchers and for La Huelga, the people in Unitarian Universalist spacers who were bringing canned goods to the strikers in the grape fields. That's what I grew up with. And the kind of story that we heard earlier of Pearl, whose mom was striking in New York City to plant trees, and the kind of story that I think many of you carry as well from your parents or relatives or heroes, is a story of intergenerational bridging. And that is a story that we are creating right now for our own children. So one of the major bridges that we are building is what our legacy will be that we pass on to the people who come after us. Because of that, one of the questions that I have as a UU lay leader is why isn't everyone in the congregation a member of the social action team? Why isn't everyone in every UU church across the country part of the social justice team? Why is that a committee? It's a journey to think about, I think, the answer to that question. But part of that, when I first joined Moose Jaw, part of what I was thinking is that we have this cycle in UU spaces of research and learning and study. And, there's an old, model that we learn and we study, and then we reflect on that. We make choices and decisions, and then we move to action. And then we reflect on the action and we study some more. And so it's learn, act, reflect, learn, act, reflect, in this ongoing circle. And many people who have a strong commitment to social justice and social action are like, why is it that oftentimes it feels like in UU spaces, people get stuck with that learning space, that we're always having another book club. We're always having another forum, another film night, and another conversation or discussion, right? The hurricane strikes and it's grab the coffee pot and run out the door and, regroup with your conversation group. Why don't we get from this discussion and conversation and move towards action and towards teaming up? So when I first joined Moose Jaw, I was thinking that a big part of the reason for that is that the bridge from learning to action looked too narrow or too shaky or too steep. And so the problem was that we needed to sort of build a bigger bridge and make it stronger and convince people that they were not alone crossing that bridge. It wasn't that narrow, that they would be safe and not fall off, that they really had enough stamina, enough strength to be able to make that crossing. My focus had been so entirely on the strength and stability of building that bridge from learning to action. And that still is a lot of what Moose Jaw is about and what we do, to try to make that a little easier. But the other piece of it is beginning to realize, as I realized crossing from Minnesota to North Dakota, that the depth of the chasm between learning and action is often just misperceived. It is not as deep and wide and scary as it looks. It's often just a little creek that we can step across in a small way and begin to act as many of you do. And that really every single person in the congregation is the Social Justice Committee, is the Social Action Team and the Climate Action Team at one time or another. And those are bridges that we move back and forth across. And that chasm between what we've learned to do and what's on the other side of actually taking action, standing with the water protectors, stepping up against state-sanctioned violence, particularly when we're seeing newer immigrants and Black and Brown people and Indigenous peoples victimized. That step can be as small as a phone call or a letter or a donation or a handshake. That bridge can be short and small. The chasm can be narrow, and we can walk across. So I think the saying of crossing the bridge when we come to it kind of no longer applies. We're already there, and we've built these bridges, wide, strong, stable, and I think all of us are in the process of crossing them and of continually monitoring and maintaining them.
For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. Oh, for each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. Oh, for each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who